Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events, issues, and people. The person we're analyzing today is Caesar Augustus. Augustus is very overlooked. In today's society, he's not as famous as other ancient Romans like Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, and I think it's because he was never the subject of a Shakespeare play or any big movies. Most Christians only know of him from the nativity story in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 2, verse 1, which states, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed." In my opinion, he is the most significant non-religious figure in history. He's probably the greatest political genius of all time. He created an empire which lasted for centuries and formed so much of the world we live in today. Augustus has probably had a bigger influence on Western civilization than anybody. Fun fact, the month of August is named after him. We essentially use the calendar invented by Julius Caesar with the help of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes. I can hear some of you screaming at me, "We don't use the Julian calendar today, we use the Gregorian calendar." My response is that the Gregorian calendar is essentially the Julian calendar with a few minor tweaks that were mandated by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. Since we essentially use the Julian calendar, we use the Roman names for months, although we anglicized most of the names of those months. And while we're discussing the names of months, there are 2 months named for people. The month of July was originally called Quintilis. The name was changed to Iulis, or July in English, in honor of Julius Caesar. Why they picked that month? It was because of his birthday. We're pretty sure that Caesar was born in the year 100 BCE, but we're not sure the date. It was either July 12 or 13. As I mentioned earlier, the other month that's named for a person is August. It's named after the subject of today's episode. That month had been known as Sextilis and is now known to us as August. Why'd they pick August? No, it's not because his birthday's in August. And since you're dying to know, his birthday was September 23 in the year 63 BCE. A lot of people erroneously believe it was chosen because that is the month when he died. He died on August 19 in the year 14 CE. But that's not the reason August was named after Augustus. They changed the name of the month while Augustus was still alive in the year 8 BCE. Supposedly, the Senate had offered to change the name of September to August because Augustus was born in September. But he picked the month of Sextilis because a lot of significant events in his life occurred during that month. It's simply a coincidence that he happened to die in the month of August 22 years later. In this episode, we will be talking a lot about years just before and after the beginning of the Common Era. You may have noticed that I say BCE and CE. Most historians and academics now use those designations for years. CE means Common Era, and BCE means before Common Era. The terms CE and BCE became popular in scientific and academic circles in the late 20th century. People used to use the terms BC and AD. BC stands for before Christ. A lot of people know that one, but most people get AD wrong. Some people think it stands for after death, meaning after the death of Jesus. But no, AD stands for the Latin term Anno Domini, meaning in the year of the Lord. So, why should we care about Caesar Augustus? He lived 2,000 years ago. Why do I argue that he's the most influential non-religious person in history? As I will explain, he saved the Roman world from disintegrating into various pieces and created the Roman Empire that would last for approximately 5 centuries, or if you count the Byzantine Empire, which I will explain later, almost 15 centuries. He established the Pax Romana, That's Latin for Roman peace. It's the time from around 27 BCE to 180 CE in the Roman Empire. It was over 2 centuries of peace and prosperity that had not been seen in the ancient world, or arguably since. And yes, I know that there were certainly some dark sides to the Roman Empire, like conquered peoples, and of course the worst aspect, widespread slavery. But compared to what most people were experiencing at the time, usually constant warfare, raiding, starvation, and killing, this was overall a good period. I've read various estimates, but there were somewhere around 60 million people in the Roman Empire during the reign of Augustus who appreciated the law, order, and stability. Most of the population got the main thing they wanted: security. Some of you might be thinking, okay, that was nice for the ancient Romans, but what's that have to do with me? The answer is that the Romans have had a very large impact on today's world. Here are the areas where they've had the biggest influence. Number 1, the calendar. As I explained earlier, we essentially use the calendar instituted by Julius Caesar with a few tweaks that were mandated by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. Because we use this Julian/Gregorian calendar, we think in terms of 12 months in a year with between 28 and 31 days assigned to each month. And even countries that have their own calendaring systems still use the Julian/Gregorian calendar to keep track of dates for all international events. And probably most important, we use a 7-day week because of the Romans. Most of us don't think about that, but we use a 7-day week because that's what the Romans used and their calendar was passed down to us. How about if we had a different number of days in a week? Today, most people get 2 days off, usually the weekends, after working 5 days, commonly called weekdays. If we had an 8-day week, would you still just get 2 days off per week? Or would you get 3? How about if we had a 10-day week? By the way, a 10-day week was tried at the time of the French Revolution. It lasted for about 12 years between 1793 to 1805, and it was brought back for a couple of weeks during the Paris Commune of 1871. That French revolutionary calendar still had 12 months, but there were 30 days in each month. Since there are approximately 365 and a quarter days in a solar year, at the end of the French calendar year, there were an extra 5 or 6 days depending upon if it was a leap year. But the really radical part of the French revolutionary calendar was that each week was 10 days long. How would society be different if we had a 10-day week instead of a 7-day week? The number 2 way the Romans influence us today: time measurement. Although separate from the calendar, our basic measurements of time come from the Romans. That is where we got the concept of dividing a day into 24 hours, 2 parts of 12 hours each. And we also get our concept that the day starts and ends at midnight from the Romans. The Romans divided the time when the sun was up into 12 hours. When the sun rose, that was the first hour. Then the second hour, the third hour, etc., up until the 12th hour at sunset. The Roman hours were different than ours because an hour in Roman times was not precisely 60 minutes like we have. They did not divide their hours into minutes and seconds. The length of an hour varied because they used 12 hours between sunrise and sunset, and then 12 hours between sunset and the following sunrise. Since the time that the sun shines changes throughout the year, the hours were not a consistent length. Daylight hours were longer in the summer and shorter in the winter because of the amount of time that the sun is shining at different times of year. Although the Romans counted hours from sunrise to sunset, we get our terms of AM and PM from them. In case you did not know what those initials stand for, they're Latin. AM stands for ante meridium, meaning before midday, which we call noon, and PM stands for post meridium, meaning after midday or noon. Without going too much down this rabbit hole, The point is, we get our concept of hours from the Romans. To be clear, the Romans did not necessarily invent all of this timekeeping. My point is the reason why we use 24 hours in a day in modern society is because of the heavy influence of ancient Rome on the development of Western civilization. The number 3 thing we get from the Romans, the alphabet. The Western world uses the Latin alphabet used by the Romans. And even parts of the world that do not use Latin letters, like in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, you still see the Latin alphabet utilized in certain circumstances, such as business and travel. All airports have a 3-letter Latin alphabet designation. The number 4 way the Romans have affected the modern world, Christianity. The spread of Christianity was greatly aided by the Roman Empire. Christianity really took hold in the year 313 CE, when emperors Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which permitted Christianity. And in 380 CE, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire with the Edict of Thessalonica. If not for the Roman Empire, would Christianity have become the dominant religion of the Western world? The number 5 way the Romans have affected the modern world, language. It's true that Latin is a dead language, but the Romance languages are descended from Latin. They're called Romance languages because they derive from the Romans. Those are Italian, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Romanian, and some smaller languages. A large percentage of the world speaks those languages. Almost the entire Western Hemisphere, except for the United States and most of Canada, speaks one of the languages descended from Latin. And the Quebec province of Canada speaks French, and most of the countries south of the United States speak either Spanish or Portuguese. I have read all kinds of different estimates, but supposedly somewhere around half of all English words have Latin roots. A lot of terms used today throughout the world come from the Romans. This is especially true with a lot of names of places like Africa and Asia. Sorry to get sidetracked, but the modern use of Roman names for regions makes me think of this. If you've ever studied World War I, you know that one of the reasons why the U.S. eventually entered the war was because of the Germans sinking the RMS Lusitania. That was a British ocean liner which was sunk on May 7, 1915 by a German U-boat with over 100 Americans on board. I bring it up because where does the name Lusitania come from? That was the Roman province in the western part of the Iberian Peninsula, generally covering what is now Portugal. Getting back to the Romans' effect on the present-day world. Reason number 6, government. The form of government for the United States was inspired by the Roman Republic. When the founding fathers were setting up the form of government for the U.S., they got the idea of separation of powers from the Romans. It's also where they got some of their terms, such as Senate and veto, and our concept of citizenship stems from the Romans. A 7th way the Romans affect the modern world is astronomy. Most of the planets have Roman names. The Romans named the 5 planets that could be seen with the naked eye. Mercury was named after the Roman god of travel and commerce. Venus was the Roman god of love and beauty. Mars was the Roman god of war. Jupiter was the king of the Roman gods. And Saturn was the Roman god of agriculture. 2 planets that were discovered in the last few centuries after the invention of the telescope were given Roman names. Neptune was the Roman god of the sea, and Pluto was the Roman god of the underworld. And yes, I know that in 2006, the International Astronomical Union declared that Pluto is no longer considered a planet, but it was considered a planet at one time. You might have noticed that I skipped over Uranus. It is the only planet with a Greek name. Uranus was the Greek god of the sky. I don't know why it was given a Greek name instead of a Roman name. The number 8 way that the Romans affect us today is their system of measurement. That's where we got the basic measurements of a foot and a mile. Again, the Romans may not have invented these measurements, but it's how these units of measurement were passed down to us. And for anybody outside the U.S. listening to this podcast episode, I can hear you laughing at us Americans that we are still saddled with the imperial system of measurements instead of switching to the much simpler and rational metric system. Okay, you get the idea. The Western world owes so much of its structure to the Roman Empire. But what about the rest of the world? Well, because of Europe dominating most of the world from the late 1400s through World War II, there is a lot of Western influence, meaning Roman influence, throughout the rest of the world. Now let's talk about names of individuals. For some ancient Romans, we use their real names, and with others we give them shortened or anglicized names. And by anglicized, I mean make them English sounding or English in character. A famous example is Marcus Antonius. That was Julius Caesar's right-hand man who played a large role in the life of Augustus. But in our society, nobody calls him by his real name. We just call him by the anglicized version of Mark Antony. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason why some people are called by their true Latin names and some get an anglicized version. For the people that are famous like Mark Antony, I will use the anglicized versions of their names because you're probably familiar with those names. In ancient Rome, some men had three-part names and some only had two-part names. Although we know him as Julius Caesar, his full name was Gaius Julius Caesar. The first name was called the praenomen, the second name was called the nomen, and the third name was called the cognomen. The praenomen was essentially like we use a first name today, like my first name of Mark. The nomen was the clan name, like our family or last names, in my case Palmer. And then some men had a third name, the cognomen. That was considered a personal nickname or identifier. It appears that they did this because so many people had the same name. So Gaius was his first name, and Julius was the clan or family name, and Caesar was the special nickname. I have been unable to find the origin of that cognomen Caesar. Now that I've given you all of this background, let's talk about the subject of today's episode. He was born on September 23 in the year 63 BCE. His name was originally Gaius Octavius. I don't find Octavius as a hard name to pronounce, but for some reason, he became known by the anglicized version of his name, Octavian. In history books, he's generally referred to as Octavian, at least until he turned 18 years old. As I will explain later, when he was 18 years old, he was adopted by Julius Caesar and took his adopted father's name. For many years, he simply went by the name Caesar. Some later emperors used the name Caesar as a title. And the name Caesar is the origin of Kaiser and Tsar. In German, Caesar became Kaiser, and that is how the emperor of Imperial Germany got his title. The same occurred in Russia with the word Tsar. That's why I always thought it was more appropriate when Tsar was spelled C-Z-A-R instead of T-S-A-R. It gets confusing to refer to the same person as Octavian and later Caesar and later Augustus. To make things easy, I will simply refer to him as Augustus, and I'll explain later where he got that name, Augustus. Augustus's father died when he was a young man, and his mother, Attia, remarried. His stepfather did not have any interest in the young Augustus, so he was raised by his grandmother. He was so intelligent and mature that when his grandmother died, Augustus gave the funeral oration even though he was only 12 years old. There are two relatives that played prominent roles in Augustus's life. One was his only sibling, his older sister Octavia. Yes, his birth name was Gaius Octavius, and her name was Octavia. That is because of the bizarre way that girls were named in ancient Rome. Girls and adult women were simply called by the feminine form of their father's nomen, meaning the clan name, or what we would consider the family name. That is why the daughter of Gaius Julius Caesar was named Julia. And since Augustus's father was also named Gaius Octavius, his sister was named Octavia. What if they had more than one daughter? Then they would call them Octavia the Elder versus Octavia the Younger, or sometimes Octavia the First, Octavia the Second, etc. This showed where women ranked in ancient Rome. Octavia remained close to her brother Augustus throughout their lives. The other relative that played a prominent role was Julius Caesar. He was Augustus's great uncle. Julius Caesar's sister was Augustus's grandmother. Caesar's sister was the mother of Attia, who was the mother of Augustus. Romans claim that their city was founded in the year 753 BCE. After several early kings, Rome became a republic. But by the 1st century BCE, the republic was falling apart. It wasn't being conquered by outside foes, it was internal strife and civil wars. It's a long and complicated story that I cannot go into in this episode. What's important for today is that there was a civil war between Julius Caesar and his army on one side versus Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus and his army on the other side. Caesar's opponent has come to be known by the anglicized name of Pompey the Great, and that's how I'll refer to him. Caesar defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus on August 9 in the year 48 BCE. Pompey survived the battle and fled to Egypt, where he was killed. Julius Caesar was now the undisputed ruler of Rome. At this point, the Romans had an enormous empire. Although they did not use that term empire, they still called it the Republic. At the height of his power, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators on the Ides of March, meaning March 15, in the year 44 BCE. Julius Caesar was a brilliant general and politician, but one of his smartest moves came to light after his death. Caesar did not have any surviving children or grandchildren. His one daughter, Julia, died in childbirth, and the baby did not survive. Ironically, she was married to Pompey the Great. In Caesar's will, he left the bulk of his enormous estate, which included lands and lots of money, to his great-nephew Augustus, known as Octavian at the time. Augustus was only 18 years old when his great-uncle was murdered. But he had accompanied Julius Caesar on a military campaign in Spain. Although Augustus did not demonstrate any amazing military prowess, apparently Julius Caesar was impressed with his great-nephew's intelligence. Even more important than the fortune bestowed upon Augustus was the fact that Julius Caesar posthumously adopted him. This might seem very odd to us. Who adopts somebody in their will? And who adopts a grown man of 18 years old? The Romans viewed adoption differently than we do. They saw it as a way to connect themselves to another person. With this adoption, Octavian became known as Gaius Julius Caesar. He simply went by the name of Caesar from this point forward. Starting in the year 27 BCE, he would become known as Augustus, but to avoid any confusion between uncle and nephew, I'm always going to refer to the subject of today's episode as Augustus. This adoption changed everything. Mark Antony referred to Augustus as a boy who owed everything to a name. And he was partially right. The fact that Augustus was being called Caesar and was considered the son of the incredibly popular and later deified Julius Caesar made Augustus very popular with all of Julius Caesar's many followers and soldiers. Augustus was in modern-day Albania when Julius Caesar was murdered. Many people around him advised him that he should stay away from Rome since there was bound to be another civil war. Instead, he went to Rome, and that's when he found out that he was the heir and adopted son of Julius Caesar. He was only 18 years old, and he was now thrusting himself into politics at the highest level of the Roman world. Think about what you were doing at 18. Can you imagine deciding to become a player on the world's biggest stage? The teenaged Augustus went forward with the help of two of his friends, Gaius Maecenas, known throughout history as Maecenas, and Marcus Vespasianus Agrippa, known as Agrippa. Maecenas remained friends with Augustus until he died in 8 BCE. He acted as an advisor to Augustus. Maecenas was a poet and served as an informal minister of culture during the reign of Augustus. He was a patron for some poets who are still known today, like Virgil and Horace. Agrippa played a much bigger role in the history of Rome. We think he was born in the same year as Augustus, 63 BCE. The two were educated together and remained friends throughout their lives. Agrippa had many talents and in his later years served in the government and built many public buildings. If you've ever been to Rome, you have probably visited the Pantheon. It's called that because it was supposed to be a temple for all of the gods. If you've never been to Rome and ever have a chance to go there, I would strongly recommend that you see the Pantheon. I think it's the coolest building in Rome. It's considered an architectural wonder. When Thomas Jefferson designed the original library for the University of Virginia, he patterned it after the Pantheon. The main part of the Pantheon is a dome. The height of the dome and the diameter of the dome are the same size, 142 feet or 43.2 meters. It was the highest dome in the world until Filippo Brunelleschi built the Cathedral of Florence's dome in the 1400s. And even though it's around 19 centuries old, the Pantheon is still the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. The most famous feature of the Pantheon is in the middle of the top of the dome. It's called the oculus. That is a circular opening which is about 29 feet or 9 meters in diameter. It provides natural light inside the Pantheon. The building that can be seen in Rome today was built in the early 100s CE, but it was built on the site of an earlier Pantheon built by Marcus Agrippa. That earlier temple had burned down. Frankly, I'm not sure how you burn down a building made out of stone or concrete. When the new Pantheon was built, they paid tribute to Agrippa since he had built the original. That is why if you go there today, above the entrance you see the inscription listing M. Agrippa as the builder. The inscription has some abbreviations, but essentially translates from Latin as Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul 3 times, made this. Agrippa's main contribution to the history of the Western world is that he was a brilliant military leader. Augustus was probably the shrewdest politician who ever lived, but he did not have the military expertise of his great-uncle Julius Caesar or his best friend Marcus Agrippa. It was Agrippa who commanded the forces under Augustus, which I will describe later on. Without Agrippa, it is very unlikely that Augustus would have been the victor of those Roman civil wars. It is extremely rare to see two people remain friends for decades when so much history is being made by the two of them. Agrippa was satisfied with being the number 2 man in the Roman Empire. Augustus raised him up high, and Agrippa was powerful and wealthy and had everything he wanted. Throughout history, so many people in that situation still want to be the very top dog. But not in this case. It's remarkable that Agrippa never tried to overthrow his buddy Augustus. He remained loyal to Augustus until he died. Now let's talk about the aftermath of the Ides of March. The senators who murdered Julius Caesar were led by 2 men, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. They are known in history as Brutus and Cassius. These 2 men and their followers really miscalculated. They thought that the people of Rome would hail them as heroes who slayed the dictator and restored the republic. The problem was most of the common people of Rome adored Julius Caesar. He had lavished gifts on the populace, and they saw him as somebody who restored order after years of civil unrest. Most of the common people did not really see the Republican form of government as any better for them than Julius Caesar's dictatorship. Brutus and Cassius ended up leaving Rome and going east because they were so unpopular with the common people. At this point, Julius Caesar's right-hand man, Mark Antony, got on the wrong side of the Roman Senate. As a result, the Senate sent an army to crush Mark Antony and his army. The army sent by the Senate was led by 3 people, consuls Pansa and Hirtius, along with the teenager Augustus. In what is now northern Italy, at the battles of Forum, Gallorum, and Mutina in April 43 BCE, the other 2 generals, Pansa and Hirtius, were killed. This left Augustus as the only surviving commander of the victorious army. Although he was beaten in battle, Mark Antony still survived and still had an army. This was one of the first instances of Augustus's political genius. Augustus made peace with Mark Antony. The 2 men reached an agreement with each other and with a 3rd Roman leader named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, known to history as Lepidus. They formed what became known as the Second Triumvirate. Of course, you're wondering, what was the first triumvirate? That was when Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, that I described earlier, and Marcus Licinius Crassus agreed to share power and to rule Rome. Crassus was killed in battle against the Parthian Empire. Julius Caesar and Pompey eventually fell out and fought the civil war I described earlier. Now, in 43 BCE, Augustus, Mark Antony, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate. They agreed to jointly rule Rome and eventually deal with Brutus and Cassius, the two men who led the assassination of Julius Caesar. Being in control of large armies would allow the Second Triumvirate to remain in power. But armies are expensive. It costs a lot to feed and maintain legions. And also, the soldiers want to get paid. Where were Augustus, Antony, and Lepidus to get the money? Augustus had a politically brilliant but ruthless idea. This program was called the Prescriptions of the Second Triumvirate. Augustus figured he could kill two birds with one stone. Julius Caesar famously forgave those who fought against him. Since he pardoned his enemies, he thought he had won them over. Instead, they plotted his murder. Augustus did not want to make the mistake his great uncle made. His plan was to eliminate all of his political enemies, and of course, the political enemies of Antony and Lepidus. With the prescriptions, the political enemies of the three members of the Second Triumvirate would be eliminated. And, just as important, the Second Triumvirate would take the money and estates of their political enemies. It worked like this. The triumvirs, meaning Augustus, Antony, and Lepidus, posted a list in the Forum. It was a death list. Rewards were paid to anybody who killed the men who were on the list. Even slaves could be paid a reward for killing somebody on the list. And how did somebody collect a reward? They had to bring the head of the dead man to the triumvirs. The ancient sources differ on the amount of men killed during the prescriptions. The most famous person killed as part of the prescriptions was Marcus Tullius Cicero. You may have heard of Cicero. He was a famous political leader of Rome as well as a well-known writer, orator, and philosopher. In the U.S., there are cities and towns named Cicero in several states, including Illinois, Indiana, New York, and Wisconsin. Those cities and towns are named after Marcus Tullius Cicero. There were a significant number of senators killed in the prescriptions, as well as other wealthy men in Rome who had either supported the assassins of Julius Caesar or in some other manner had become the enemies of Augustus, Antony, or Lepidus. Armed with the money from the prescriptions, the Second Triumvirate could now go after Brutus and Cassius and the large army they had raised in the east. The showdown occurred in October 42 BCE in modern-day Greece. It's known as the Battle of Philippi. At least I think that's how it's pronounced. Lepidus remained in Rome while Augustus and Antony led the army at Philippi. There were actually two battles, both of which occurred in October in the year 42 BCE. In the first battle, the forces led by Cassius were defeated. Cassius thought that the entire army, including the part led by Brutus, was also defeated. Not true, but since Cassius thought that his side had completely lost, he killed himself. The second part of the battle occurred about 3 weeks later. Brutus's troops were beaten and Brutus killed himself. The triumvirate had avenged the assassination of Julius Caesar. With Brutus and Cassius dead, was there anybody left to challenge the triumvirs? Yes, Sextus Pompeius, known in history as Sextus Pompey. He was the son of Pompey the Great, who had been part of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Crassus. Now Pompey's son Sextus was the last military opponent of the second triumvirate. Sextus controlled the island of Sicily. If you look at a map, Sicily is in the middle of the Mediterranean, and the triumvirs could not afford to have an adversary controlling that strategic island. At first, the triumvirs signed a peace treaty with Sextus, but it didn't last long. In 36 BCE, a navy commanded by Agrippa defeated Sextus at sea, and an army led by Lepidus invaded Sicily. Sextus was defeated, he was later captured, and executed. There was nobody left to oppose the second triumvirate. Although the empire would remain intact, the three men divided up who would govern what parts of the empire. Augustus governed the west, and Antony governed the east. Lepidus was always the weakest of the three rulers and was essentially marginalized at this point. He was given the command over Africa. Now it's time to discuss a woman who is central to this story. Cleopatra. She was born in 69 BCE. Let's put that into perspective. Although she was born almost 21 centuries ago, she is closer to our time than she was to the building of the Great Pyramid in Giza, which was built around 25 centuries before Cleopatra was born. I recently went on vacation to Egypt with my wife and her 2 grown kids. It took approximately 23 hours of travel time from Los Angeles to Cairo, but it was totally worth it. Standing in front of the pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx is just mind-boggling. At the time that Julius Caesar was murdered, Egypt was still a separate kingdom. Cleopatra was born into the ruling family. However, she was not ethnically Egyptian, she was ethnically Greek, or actually Macedonian. Why was this? It was due to the lasting effects of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world, including Egypt, in the 300s BCE. However, he died as a young man. He was only 32 years old when he died in the year 323 BCE. When Alexander died, the empire which he had conquered split into pieces. One of his generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt and installed his own dynasty, which lasted for almost 3 centuries. That dynasty ended with the death of Cleopatra. Of great significance to this story is that Cleopatra had a son with Julius Caesar. Officially, he was Ptolemy the 15th, but he is always referred to by his nickname Caesarion, which meant Little Caesar. And no, he had nothing to do with the American pizza chain. I will only refer to their son by his nickname, Caesarion, because that's how he's known throughout history. Julius Caesar never publicly acknowledged Caesarion as his son, but Cleopatra made sure that everybody knew who Caesarion's father was. Around 41 BCE, Mark Antony started his romance with Cleopatra. For a while, Antony lived with Cleopatra in Alexandria, Egypt. Remember, he was controlling the eastern half of the Roman Empire. In 40 BCE, Antony had to leave Egypt for military and political reasons. While he was gone, Cleopatra gave birth to twins who Antony acknowledged as his own children. The twins were a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene II. They are commonly referred to as Helios and Selene, the sun and the moon. Just like Caesar before him, Mark Antony was married to a Roman woman while carrying on his affair with Cleopatra. Conveniently for Antony, his wife at the time, Fulvia, died in 40 BCE, the same year that Cleopatra gave birth to the twins. To complicate matters, Mark Antony married another Roman woman after Fulvia died. The reason for this marriage was purely political. Powerful men in Rome often cemented their alliances through marriage. So Augustus arranged his sister Octavia to marry Mark Antony. The purpose of this marriage was to demonstrate to the Roman people that the alliance between Antony and Augustus was still in effect. This marriage occurred in October 40 BCE. I'm skipping over some family details of prior marriages and other children because they're not critical to the story of Augustus. Octavia eventually had 2 daughters with Mark Antony. They both had kids from prior marriages. Octavia lived with Antony in Athens. At this time, Greece was a Roman province, and Antony was governing the eastern half of the Roman world from Athens. Nevertheless, Antony had to travel about the eastern Mediterranean since he was in charge of that half of the Roman world and would be away from Octavia for long periods. Not surprisingly, Antony marrying Octavia and having children with her had a souring effect on his relationship with Cleopatra. But those 2 crazy lovers got back together in 37 BCE in a meeting in Antioch in modern-day Turkey. Cleopatra brought the twins she had with Antony. They were now 3 years old, and this was the first time he had seen them. In the summer of 36 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony had another son who was named Ptolemy Philadelphus. The second triumvirate was never meant to last. Eventually, only one man could come out on top. Augustus easily removed Lepidus from power. Lepidus remained as Pontifex Maximus, meaning the head of religion in Rome, but it had no real political power. Lepidus lived out a peaceful life, but outside the realms of power until his death in 13 BCE. Once Lepidus lost all authority except Pontifex Maximus, this left two men ruling the enormous Roman Empire. Although Mark Antony was a good general, he was no match for Augustus when it came to politics. In the autumn of 34 BCE, there was an event which has come down through history as the Donations of Alexandria. In a lavish ceremony, Antony and Cleopatra distributed lands which were held by Rome and Parthia to Cleopatra's children and granted those children titles, reflecting that they were now monarchs over these lands. Augustus understood that he and Antony were both very popular with the public. If he was going to succeed, he would have to have the public on his side and against Antony. Augustus achieved this in three ways. Number one, Augustus publicized the fact that Antony had given Roman provinces to Cleopatra and her children that I just told you about. The people of Rome were incensed. What kind of Roman leader gives Roman provinces to a foreign queen and her children? Number two, Antony was still married to Augustus's sister Octavia while he was living in Athens with his lover Cleopatra, and Octavia was living in Rome. In 35 BCE, Augustus sent his sister to visit Antony in Athens. Antony refused to see Octavia and sent her back to Rome. Augustus made sure that the public knew of this whole affair. The Roman people could tolerate one of their leaders having sex on the side with a foreigner, but Antony chose the Egyptian queen over his Roman wife. This could not be tolerated. Mark Antony divorced Octavia in 32 BCE. Number 3, a last will and testament for high-ranking Romans was kept in the Temple of Vesta. You may have heard of the Vestal Virgins. They were women who kept a fire burning in the Temple of Vesta. The Vestal Virgins were treated with great respect and had great privileges. However, if a woman who was a Vestal Virgin broke her vows, meaning she had sex with a man, the punishment was extreme. She would be buried alive. Talk about harsh. When a will had been placed in the Temple of Vesta, nobody was supposed to touch it except for the person who wrote the will, until that person died. But in 32 BCE, Augustus risked the possible political fallout and sent men to the Temple of Vesta and got Mark Antony's will. His gamble paid off. Augustus read the will to the Senate. In his will, Mark Antony destroyed his reputation with the Roman people by demanding, first, that he be buried in Alexandria next to Cleopatra, and second, Antony left all of his property to the children he had with Cleopatra and not the thoroughly Roman kids he had with Octavia. In his will, Mark Antony was picking Cleopatra and Egypt over Rome. This was the final straw. The Senate officially stripped Mark Antony of all of his political titles and approved all-out war against Cleopatra. This was another brilliant political move by Augustus. He just prompted the Senate to declare war against Cleopatra. That was much easier than declaring war against the leading Roman like Mark Antony. But Augustus knew that Antony would of course defend Cleopatra, and Augustus could finally defeat and destroy Antony once and for all. Let's proceed to the Battle of Actium, which was a naval battle off the coast of Greece on September 2, 31 BCE. Although Augustus was in overall command, he had his best friend and military genius, Marcus Agrippa, in actual command. To make sure that nothing bad happened in Rome while he was gone, Augustus left his close friend Maecenas in charge of the city. One of the reasons for his success was the fact that Augustus could completely rely on Agrippa and Maecenas. There was never any hint of jealousy or treachery. That was very rare throughout history for any ruler to have such close confidants on whom he could completely rely. Cleopatra was with Antony in Greece leading up to the climatic clash. She even provided many of the ships for the battle. The short version is Augustus's forces won the battle at sea, most of Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was destroyed, and the majority of their soldiers on land eventually surrendered. Antony and Cleopatra survived the Battle of Actium because both fled the fighting on ships headed towards Alexandria. After the showdown at Actium, Augustus had to resolve other matters before he chased down Antony and Cleopatra and the remnants of their military forces. In the summer of 30 BCE, when Augustus landed his army in Alexandria, it was all over. Antony was led to believe that Cleopatra killed herself. Antony tried to kill himself by stabbing himself in the stomach. He did not die immediately, and while he was bleeding out, he was advised that Cleopatra was still alive. He asked to be brought to her, and he died in her arms at the age of 53. Cleopatra tried to negotiate with Augustus, but he did not succumb to her charms like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. When she realized that he was going to take her to Rome to appear in his triumph, she decided to kill herself. By the way, a triumph is what the Romans called a special military parade celebrating a victory, often with prominent prisoners on display. There are two different versions of how she died. Both result from her attendants sneaking into her chamber, the thing that killed her. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, an extremely poisonous snake, known as an asp, was smuggled in and she let it bite her. Other sources say that she ingested poison. Either way, she committed suicide. Even though he was annoyed by this outcome because he was cheated out of parading Cleopatra through the streets of Rome in his triumph, Augustus ordered that Cleopatra be buried next to Mark Antony in a rare act of kindness to his enemies. So what happened to Cleopatra's kids? Cleopatra had sent Caesarion to Upper Egypt to escape from Augustus. Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is in the north. That's because the Egyptians were referring to the upper part of the Nile River and the lower part of the Nile River. It just happens that, due to popular convention, when we draw maps, we have north at the top and south at the bottom. Anyway, within a couple of weeks after Cleopatra died, Augustus's forces found Caesarion and killed him. There could not be two living sons of Julius Caesar. And what about the kids that Cleopatra had with Mark Antony? Helios, Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were sent by Augustus to Rome to be raised by his sister Octavia. Augustus did not have people killed for spite or revenge. He only did so for cold political reasons. After decades of political and military strife, Rome was at peace, and one man was the undisputed leader. Augustus may not have had the military talents of his great-uncle Julius Caesar, but he was smarter politically. He was determined to set up a government structure that would last for centuries. Although he would hold absolute power, he would not embarrass the rich and powerful men in Rome. How did he do that? My grandmother spoke very little English. She mainly spoke Italian, which meant I usually understood only about half of what she was saying to me. One of her favorite phrases was fesso e contento. In Italian, that means a fool is happy. You make a fool out of somebody, but you make them happy. That's pretty much what Augustus did to the members of the Senate in Rome. While he made fools of them, he would keep them happy. He was going to have absolute power just like Julius Caesar did, but he wouldn't stick it in their faces like his great-uncle did. He would allow these rich and powerful men to hold prestigious positions, provided he had the ultimate power. Augustus was never called emperor. He did not even use the title dictator like Julius Caesar did. By the way, a dictator in ancient Rome was different than like the way we think of Adolf Hitler as a dictator. In ancient Rome, a dictator was not for life. He was given almost absolute power to deal with a particular crisis. Once the crisis was over, the dictatorial powers were gone. A dictator was a legal position, but Augustus avoided that position because it implied he would step down. Augustus adopted the title of first citizen. In Latin, he was called the princeps. I'm not sure how to pronounce that Latin word. I've heard it pronounced princeps as well as princeps. I think it's princeps, so that's what I'll go with. That term, first citizen, was a much nicer and less threatening sounding name. We call Augustus and all of the people who followed him, like Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, and Nero, emperors. But in ancient Rome, they did not call them the emperor. They were the first citizen, the princeps. In possibly his most brilliant political move, Augustus announced to the Senate in January 27 BCE that he was retiring and giving up all of his powers and command of his legions. Essentially, he was offering to restore the Republic as it was before the Civil Wars. You would think that the senators would have rejoiced that they were getting their sovereignty back, but no. The senators begged him to keep all of his authority and powers, including command of his legions. Why'd they do this? It's because they feared the chaos and possible civil wars if he stepped down. That is when the Senate bestowed upon him the title Augustus, meaning the revered or respected one. Think about what an incredible move this was. Who could accuse Augustus of being a tyrant? He offered to step down and retire from public life, but the Senate begged him to stay. Augustus kept the appearance of the Roman Republic form of government. There were still senators and consuls and all of the other government posts. Under the Roman Republic, there was no one person in command like a president or prime minister. Instead, there were always two consuls. They were equal in power and served for 1 year. Augustus arranged that he was often one of the two consuls. He was consul 13 times. But what about those years when Augustus was not a consul? He would always be in control because he was always in command of the army. When you control the army, you control the state. Augustus even set this up in a way that was not so blatant. The Roman Empire was divided up into provinces. Augustus gave control of many of the provinces to the Senate, and he was in charge of the other provinces. What mattered was that the provinces Augustus commanded were the ones on the frontiers. Why was that important? It's because that's where the army was. The Romans did not need to keep large armed forces in Italy or other places not threatened. The troops were stationed along the frontiers, ready to confront the enemies of Rome. Whoever was in control of those provinces controlled the armies stationed there. Augustus did not flaunt his power. He lived in a nice house, but similar to the type of homes that other wealthy Romans lived in. You may have heard of the 7 Hills of Rome. Well, Augustus lived on the Palatine Hill. Because he lived there, that's where we get the word palace today. People could come meet Augustus at his house. He gave the image of an approachable ruler. Augustus said that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He left Rome and the empire in a much better state than it was when he took over. Augustus, along with his best friend Agrippa, improved the infrastructure in the city and the empire. He built roads. Most people have heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. What that means is the fact that the Romans built most of the roads in ancient times. Today, we take roads for granted, but imagine what it was like to try to travel when there were no roads. It was especially hard during rain or any other bad weather. The Roman roads were so durable that some still exist today. I don't know about other parts of the world, but the freeways in the US are not going to exist 2,000 years from now. A lot of the infrastructure was built with Augustus's own money. He built aqueducts to carry water to cities and farms. Again, some of those aqueducts are still functioning. Their incredible water system is the reason why they could have a population in the city of Rome of about 1 million people. The Romans also developed incredible architecture. Augustus built public buildings, including temples and public baths. Public baths might not seem like a big deal to us today, but this was a time when people did not have showers or bathtubs in their own homes. It was a luxury to be able to go to a public bath. This was at a time when most people in the world did not bathe very often, to say the least. And people were happy with the way Rome was operated. Augustus organized a civil service system to run the city and the empire. Possibly the most popular thing Augustus did was give out food to the masses. You may have heard of that term, bread and circuses. In Latin, it is panem et circenses. The term comes from the Roman poet Juvenal in his 10th satire, The Vanity of Human Wishes. Juvenal was talking about the common Romans, saying they shed their sense of responsibility long ago when they lost their votes and the bribes. The mob that used to grant power, high office, the legions, everything, curtails its desires and reveals its anxiety for 2 things only, bread and circuses. In other words, The Romans were satisfied as long as they got food and entertainment. Augustus provided them both. He gave free grain to the poor and put on huge public feasts, which were giant meals open to everybody on holidays and public celebrations. He also provided free entertainment. People always just think of the horrendous gladiatorial games, which I find appalling. But he also put on chariot races as well as theatrical performances in the large public theaters that he built or renovated. The point is that Augustus set up a system that the Roman people wanted to keep. Overall, people were happy with stability, security, and prosperity. These are not my personal wishes. I am very happy living in a democracy and do not want a benevolent dictator. I'm just telling you the way it was in ancient Rome. Now let's talk a little bit about Augustus's personal life. He was married 3 times. His first wife was Claudia. She was the stepdaughter of Mark Antony. She was the daughter of Fulvia, Antony's 3rd wife, from her previous marriage. This was a political marriage. The marriage was short and there were no children. Augustus divorced Claudia so he can marry an older woman named Scribonia. They had a daughter named Julia who ended up being Augustus's only biological child. This was another political marriage. Augustus married Scribonia to strengthen his relationship with Sextus Pompey, who was somehow related to Scribonia. Remember the guy I told you about earlier who was in command of Sicily and was the son of Pompey the Great? Yeah, that guy. While Scribonia was pregnant, Augustus fell in love with a woman named Livia Drusilla. Livia proved to be the love of his life, so much so that he risked an enormous scandal. He divorced Scribonia either on the day she gave birth to their daughter Julia or the day after, so he could marry Livia. To add to the scandal, Livia was also married at the time and pregnant. She was married to a guy named Tiberius Claudius Nero. They already had one son who eventually became the second emperor, Tiberius. Livia divorced her husband while she was still pregnant and then gave birth to her second son, Nero Claudius Drusus, known to history as Drusus. By Roman law, both of the sons went to Livia's ex-husband. Of course, by Roman law, that meant that Augustus had custody of his daughter Julia. Soon after they were both divorced, Augustus and Livia were married. Although he was not a king but simply the first citizen, Augustus really wanted to have an heir. Of course, that meant a son. There was no way a woman was going to be made ruler of the Roman Empire. Although they tried to have children, they did not have any children who survived. Along with his great-uncle Julius Caesar, his sister Octavia, and his best friend Agrippa, Livia was one of the 4 most important people in the life of Augustus. They stayed married until he died. It seems that he deeply loved her. I think this is evident by the fact that the 2 of them never had any children who survived. Most men in that situation would have divorced his wife for a younger woman who could provide him with a son to be his heir. They always blame the woman in those situations. The fact that Augustus never divorced Livia demonstrates how he felt about her. Livia was purportedly very intelligent, and Augustus supposedly relied on her a lot for her insight and advice. But this was Rome, where women had no power. As a result, because of the perceived influence she had on the first citizen, there were all kinds of crazy rumors about Livia. Let me explain. As I told you earlier, Augustus never had a son. His one biological child was his daughter Julia. Julia's first husband was a man named Marcellus. Besides being the son-in-law of Augustus, he was also the nephew of Augustus. Marcellus was the son of Augustus's only sibling, Octavia. Yeah, Julia and Marcellus were first cousins. It seemed clear that Augustus was grooming Marcellus to succeed him, but Marcellus died of an illness in the year 23 BCE. We believe that some virus or some other serious illness swept through Rome, and even Augustus suffered from it but recovered. Augustus arranged the next marriage for his daughter Julia to his best friend, Marcus Agrippa. There was a 24-year age difference between Agrippa and Julia. This marriage produced 5 children, 2 girls and 3 boys. Unfortunately, in terms of heirs, only the boys counted. Although they were his grandsons, Augustus adopted the two older boys to make it clear that they were in line to succeed him. He later adopted the youngest son as well. As I explained earlier, the Romans viewed adoption differently than we do today. It was often used to pass on an inheritance or to cement a relationship. None of those three sons would become emperor after the death of Augustus. Two would die before him. The oldest was Gaius, who died in the year 4 CE at the age of 23 in modern-day Turkey. Gaius suffered a wound in battle which eventually killed him. Was it gangrene or something else resulting from the wound? We don't know. The second oldest was Lucius, who died 2 years before his brother. Lucius died at the age of 18 or 19 in the year 2 CE in Gaul, modern-day France, from an unknown illness. And now it's time to discuss the crazy rumors about Livia. Without any proof at all, and based entirely on gossip, some in ancient Rome accused Livia of killing 3 of the heirs of Augustus and even killing Augustus himself. According to the rumors, Livia killed Marcellus, Gaius, and Lucius to clear the way for one of her sons to become emperor. Livia's son Drusus died before Augustus, but Tiberius did succeed his stepfather to become the second emperor. And when Augustus died, there was a rumor that Livia had fed him some poisoned figs. It really seems that these rumors were just because of insecure men in Rome. Women were supposed to be submissive to their husbands. A woman like Livia, who had influence in the government of Rome, was greatly resented by most men who were jealous of her power. I think these rumors about Livia are ludicrous. Let's deal with her supposedly poisoning her husband. It's ridiculous that she would poison him for the following reasons. Number one, Augustus was almost 77 years old when he died. That was an incredible age for those days. He had been ill for quite some time. As far as we know, he just died of natural causes. Number two, there was no advantage for her to kill him. They were married for over 50 years at that point. From what we know, they seemed to be genuinely in love. She had a much stronger position as the longtime wife of the first citizen than she would have as the mother of the new emperor. According to the ancient historian Lucius Cassius Dio, Livia did not get along well with her son. He said that Tiberius cordially hated his mother. I love the fact that I can look up online writings from somebody like Cassius Dio, who wrote his Roman history in the early 200s CE. Number 3, she would have been taking a great risk to poison Augustus. If she was caught, she certainly faced a painful death. Number 4, the timing does not make sense. All 3 of the possible heirs, Marcellus, Gaius, and Lucius, were dead by the year 4 CE. At that point, Tiberius was clearly the heir apparent. If she was going to kill her husband, she would have done so at that point. Why wait 10 years to kill Augustus if she truly wanted to make her son the next emperor? During that time, Augustus and Tiberius might have had an irrevocable falling out, and Tiberius would not be in line to succeed his stepfather. Now let's talk about the supposed murders of the 3 young heirs of Augustus, Marcellus, Gaius, and Lucius. I don't believe that Livia had any of those 3 young men killed. Marcellus died as a result of a virus or some other serious illness that swept through Italy and almost killed Augustus himself. Gaius died as a result of complications from a wound he suffered in battle. And think of the logistics. Gaius died in modern-day Turkey and Lucius died in Gaul, modern-day France. How did she manage to have these murders carried out so far away? And even if she wanted to kill them, wouldn't it have been much easier to do so at times when they were back in Rome and she was close by? Obviously, I can't say for sure whether these rumors about a woman who lived 2,000 years ago are true or not. Nobody knows for sure. But it should be noted that the 2 main historians who wrote about Livia being a murderer and a conspirator against her husband were Publius Cornelius Tacitus and Lucius Cassius Dio. We don't know exactly when Tacitus wrote his histories, but it was approximately a century after these events. And Cassius Dio is even worse. His histories were written 2 centuries after these events. Imagine trying to write a history of events from 100 or 200 years ago without newspapers, magazines, diaries, or other documents that were generated at the time. If you were just relying on speaking to people who heard from second-hand or third-hand sources about these events, how much could you really rely on these accounts? It's possible that Tacitus and Cassius Dio were relying on documents from the times of these events that no longer exist today. But it is very doubtful that there would have been any documentation of Livia's supposed conspiracies and treachery. So the next time you hear of Livia having these people killed and manipulating everything behind the scenes, consider what I've laid out for you and the reasons why I don't believe those rumors. Augustus died on August 19 in the year 14 CE. He ruled for over 40 years and had a longer reign than any other Roman emperor. His wife, Livia, died in 29 CE. Augustus's stepson Tiberius became the second Roman emperor. The Roman Empire was eventually split in half. The Western Roman Empire was ultimately ruled from Ravenna in modern-day Italy, and the Eastern Empire was ruled from Constantinople. Although it was no longer the capital, in the year 410 CE, the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under King Alaric. Most historians list the date of the complete fall of the Western Roman Empire as the year 476 CE, when the last Roman emperor, named Romulus Augustus, was deposed by Germanic tribes led by a man named Odoacer. I've heard it pronounced various ways. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years. They referred to themselves as the Roman Empire, but we know them as the Byzantine Empire. In the latter stages of its existence, the Byzantine Empire was being whittled down by the Ottoman Empire. By 1453, only the capital of Constantinople remained of the once mighty Byzantine Empire. In May 1453, the Ottomans finally captured Constantinople. The Ottomans changed the name to Istanbul, which it's known by today in modern Turkey. That was the end of all vestiges of the Roman Empire created by Caesar Augustus. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. If you're listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and then tap Write a Review. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find fun items for all the history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.